So this module is about improving carb tolerance, and it is part 3 of the macros and calories modules. So there is no getting around the fact that obesity is a huge problem, and many people are overweight. This figure on the left does not include those that are overweight and only considers up to 2018, with a 42.4% obesity prevalence. And then this study on the right found that in 2018, 93% of Americans are not metabolically healthy, with more than a third of the US adult population having prediabetes. And the stats are all likely worse today. So why are Americans getting fatter and fatter? Why are metabolisms plummeting? While many people overeat for their current activity levels, there is a little bit more to the story, as many people have broken metabolisms and have lost the ability to effectively burn glucose. So in this section, let's review why this has happened, why people have lost the ability to burn glucose effectively, and how to fix it. This information in this section may not apply to everyone, since some of you are using glucose just fine, but it can apply to those that are struggling with weight or the ability to tolerate carbs well. And the macros and dietary approach are not a long-term thing, but can be very helpful to regain the ability to use glucose and improve metabolism. So let's dive into some of the nuances about broken metabolisms and why the ideal macronutrient composition for you, so total amount of carb, fat, and protein, can change over time as you improve metabolism. So in this section, let's discuss what our ancestors ate, how human body fat has changed, are Americans in hibernation mode, what it means to actually utilize glucose well, how to improve carb tolerance, and we will discuss on things like insulin. So we want a high metabolic rate, as this leads to improved function of the entire bodily system. And carbs help us achieve this optimal high metabolic rate, but only if we're actually burning them. And many people do not utilize carbs well. So to better understand what being good at using carbs means, it's helpful to briefly return to cellular energy production. The food we consume is just filled with energized electrons. So the whole point of metabolism is to oxidize the food we eat. So it's all about the flow of electrons. And our metabolism is limited by how much NAD+ we have. So the more NAD+ we have, this means more carrier molecules to bring electrons all the way to the end electron acceptor, shown here on the right, oxygen, which maximizes ATP production. When electrons can't flow through the electron transport chain to generate ATP, we get buildups and reductive stress. So the more we move electrons through the electron transport chain, the more ATP we generate, and the more energy our body has to function. So an old saying in the medical literature was, quote, fat burns in the flame of carbohydrates. So we can actually use and burn fat well in the flame of carbs. So when you're actually burning glucose, it lowers NADH so that there's a better redox state in the cell. So when NADH actually pushes the electrons into complex 1 of the electron transport chain, the NADH converts back to NAD+. So you'll have more NAD+, which is what you actually need to run your metabolism and utilize both carbs and fat well, as fat requires a lot of NAD+ and oxygen. So again, we want a high NAD+ to NADH ratio so that the electron flow continues and we avoid buildups. So in the case of someone who is overweight with a low metabolic rate, this can almost be synonymous with can't utilize carbs well. When we eat carbs, we want the carbs to be burned and used. You don't want them to just sit there. And interestingly, people who are obese burn fat, not carbs. In fact, a hallmark characteristic of human obesity and those that are overweight is the lack of ability to effectively burn glucose. Low levels of NAD+ and high levels of NADH, also called reductive stress, is commonly seen in obesity and diabetes, and we include links to these references in the PDF module script. So why is this the case? Well, their mitochondria have a buildup of electrons, so they are experiencing reductive stress, low ratio of NAD+ to NADH, too much energy in the cell. And this inhibits pyruvate dehydrogenase, PDH, and this is the enzyme that's the limiting factor for how quickly glucose can be burned. In 1975, it was documented that PDH activity, which is shown with a red arrow here, is inhibited by reductive stress, specifically high levels of NADH and electrons, this ultimately hindering glucose metabolism. So there are lots of NADH around with nowhere for the electrons to flow to, looking like energy overload as electrons require NAD+ for transport to where they need to go. So they don't get the beneficial carbohydrate-induced thermogenesis, and instead, their blood sugar just remains elevated since they aren't using the carbs well. As we reviewed in the intro chapter, the electron transport chain is responsible for full glucose oxidation. So those who don't handle carbs well often just perform glycolysis. They stop short and they do not experience the benefits of full carb oxidation and instead rely on excessive fatty acid oxidation. At this point in time, you may not be good at utilizing glucose, as this is very common these days due to PUFAs, environmental toxins, micronutrient deficiencies, restrictive diets, excessive protein consumption, estrogenic personal care products, being generally inactive, and more. But don't worry, you can and will regain your ability to utilize glucose. If you have avoided carbs for a long period of time, you cannot expect your carb oxidizing machinery to be fine-tuned immediately. But you can't just add more electrons to the pool. In reductive stress, this NADH builds up, and so then electrons build up, and the TCA cycle, otherwise known as the citric acid cycle, slows down. So we get more and more buildups. You have to remove the things that are blocking the electron flow. So the goal should be to relearn how to utilize glucose by removing the metabolic brakes that inhibit the electron transport chain. We can then improve metabolism and be able to eat more food, a wider variety of food, and more carbs without gaining a ton of weight. But before we get started, how do we know if we're using carbs well? So there would be some obvious symptoms after a meal containing carbs, but you can get some simple blood work done, like fasting glucose or fasting insulin. You can also assess at home with a simple blood glucose monitor after consuming a carb-rich meal. So record your blood sugar before the meal, after the meal, then 1 hour and 2 hours later. So ideally you should see a spike and then return back to baseline. If your blood sugar remains elevated, you're not utilizing glucose well and could use some improvements. No big deal. The ability to use glucose can return within just a few weeks. So some people may think that we advocate for a low-fat diet based on what we said in the last video module, and we often receive pushback about this due to the well-documented health benefits of dietary fat. We are not anti-dietary fat, but in this video, we will explain why we do suggest a low-fat approach to fix a broken metabolism. And we do ask that you keep an open mind, as we've helped hundreds of individuals improve their metabolism through this course and one-on-one clients. When one is in a broken metabolic state, you may need to be a lot more intentional with their macronutrient split for a period of time to relearn how to use glucose. However, that macro composition you choose can really change over time as you improve your level of body fat, improve your metabolism. For example, if you are lean or use glucose well, you can get away with a more mixed diet approach with more dietary fat, if that is your preference. In fact, our ancestors ate somewhat of a mixed diet, with some reports showing lower fat while others showing more moderate fat. So here on the left is an example from a old-fashioned cookbook called Cookbook 365 from the year 1915. And for women at light labor, for example, the recommended protein intake was 100, recommended fat intake was 100, and the recommended carb intake was 320. For men at light labor, the recommended protein was 125, recommended fat was 125, and the recommended carbs was 400. And then on the right, from a resource called Eating for Strength in 1888, they list some calorie and macronutrient compositions for a wide variety of individuals. So let's just look at a few examples. So let's look at moderate exercise and active labor. So for moderate exercise individuals, they recommend 119 grams of protein, 51 grams of fat, 530 grams of carbs. Active labor, 155 grams of protein, 70 grams of fat, and 566 grams of carbs. So between these two examples, you can definitely tell that they ate somewhere around a moderate fat, moderate to high carb approach. And here are some more examples. So this is from a cookbook from 1893 called What Shall We Eat? And it provided meals for all weeks out of the year. So here's an example of meals for the third week in August. And they typically ate 3 meals a day. So breakfast, dinner, and supper. They actually didn't use the word lunch and instead used dinner for lunch and then supper for dinner. And all of their meals were mixed meals. So they contained all 3 macronutrients, carbs, fat, and protein. So here's an example of what they ate on a Tuesday during the third week in August in 1893. For breakfast, you've got carbs, fat, and protein. So the carbs listed are apple, rice, potatoes, rolls and buns, sugar. Fat, they had some cream and they used fat to fry the potatoes, and then their protein was veal. For lunch, otherwise known as dinner for them, their carbs were the flour in their rolls, stuffing and pie, potatoes, and the sugar. In the fat that they used in this meal was butter in their roll and stuffing, butter in the pie crust, and then the fat in the milk. And their protein at this meal was beef, milk, and other dairy sources. And then lastly on this day, their supper, their carbs were bread and popovers. They had cake, pears, chocolate, and sugar. The fat sources in that meal were eggs, the butter in the popovers, and the fat in the chocolate. And then the protein at that meal were eggs and dairy. And just another example to just show that they did consume all three macronutrients in each meal. And so this is from a book called The Queen of the Household in 1896. And it is a full list of meals for January. So just as an example, for Monday, their meals were for breakfast, they had milk, toast, rolls, broiled steak, and fried apples. For lunch, they had roast duck, applesauce, beef stew, mashed turnips, baked sweet potatoes, celery, plum pudding with sauce, fruitcake, and oranges. And then for their dinner, they had light biscuit, cold meat, whipped cream with preserves, and sliced beef. So pretty consistently, they ate connective tissue-rich meat, broth, eggs, dairy. They ate saturated fat from animal fats and chocolate, and they consistently had fruit, sugar, flour, bread, potatoes, and vegetables. And eating this way for them, they were not obese, they did not have health issues and high chronic disease rates, and they instead had high metabolic rates. So while they certainly ate a mixed diet, they also weren't metabolically damaged like many of us are now. And the better your metabolic rate and level of leanness, the more you can follow more of a mixed diet with ease. The body is designed to utilize both fuel sources, carbs and fat, with a well-functioning metabolism. When a healthy person eats a mixed meal of fat and carbs, insulin is released, which cuts off lipolysis, so fat being released by fat cells to feed the body, and it increases glucose uptake and glucose oxidation rates. Unlike what some people will say, this is a good thing, not a bad thing, as fat burning gets turned back on later in the day, in between meals. And of course, it's not good to have elevated insulin levels and constantly high blood glucose levels. But this is because the body isn't using carbs well. When insulin is working well, meaning it isn't chronically elevated, but it is activated a few times a day from meals, it's actually very beneficial, despite what low-carb gurus will tell you. So insulin activates the PDH enzyme, which is good, and this is the limiting step that allows glucose to burn in the electron transport chain in our mitochondria. Insulin lowers blood sugar, and insulin lowers circulating branch chain amino acids, BCAAs, and prevents the breakdown of your muscle tissues. So this helps you protect your precious muscle mass. Insulin lowers free fatty acids and BCAAs, which allows glucose to burn, which is what we want. Many people in a low-carb state can actually be breaking down muscle mass, and that is releasing branch chain amino acids, BCAAs, into your bloodstream, making you temporarily insulin resistant. And relying on stress hormones more for gluconeogenesis in a low-carb state can actually promote fatty acid oxidation and induce a state of insulin resistance where we aren't utilizing carbs well. So after a mixed meal, you're supposed to burn the glucose first to prevent high postprandial blood glucose. And the literature documents that lean people are better at doing this than fat people. With metabolic problems, your glucose usage is poor, so the body uses amino acids and fatty acids as fuel. So there is a breakdown of muscle and fat mass to meet the body's need for energy. It is well documented in the literature that obese and overweight people have high levels of free fatty acids in their blood, which is one thing that's preventing the proper usage of glucose. And so if we reflect on what our ancestors were eating, I will argue that this mixed diet that they consumed worked great until we changed the types of fat we consume. So we have drastically increased PUFA consumption. For example, we've swapped saturated fat-rich butter for polyunsaturated fatty acid, PUFA-rich margarine or vegetable oils. And on top of that, we're inundated with plastics and other endocrine disruptors. So this change in dietary fat has changed the type of fat inside of us. Humans are now not really made up how we used to be made up when it comes to the types of body fat we have inside of us, due to an increase in PUFA consumption, less collagen consumption, environmental toxins, and an increase in plastic use and plastic exposure. And this has damaged our metabolisms. The internal environment of body fat composition impacts how our body functions, as fats are not only energy and structural components, but they also serve as signaling molecules in the body. In 1943, American body fat was approximately 36% saturated, 43% monounsaturated, and 10% PUFA. By 1998, just about 50 years later, those ratios shifted to 24% saturated, 55% monounsaturated, and 21% polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFAs. So humans not only have more fat, but our fat is made up differently. Levels of MUFA and PUFA have risen, and levels of saturated fat have decreased. So we are less saturated and more unsaturated, which lowers our metabolic rate. And that data was 1998. Imagine what the levels are now in 2024. The more saturated your body fat, the higher your metabolic rate, and thus the more you can eat while maintaining a good body weight. This is demonstrated well by the fact that starch-eating cultures who have rather saturated body fat levels remain quite lean despite eating very high calorie. The type of fat we consume and the metabolic state of our body impacts the type of fat our tissues are made up of. And this is supported by the well-documented decline in body temperature, indicating lower metabolic rates. On top of that, Dr. Speakman, who's one of the leading researchers in metabolism, found that there has been a significant reduction in our basal metabolic rates, BMRs, meaning we don't burn many calories at rest. And why is this happening? Reductive stress, which lowers metabolism. So reductive stress and low metabolic rates are almost synonymous. And this is starting to be uncovered more in the research. So here's a quote from this research paper. Researchers at Massachusetts General Hospital have uncovered an unexpected connection between an imbalance of electrons in liver cells and many metabolic problems that increase the risk of conditions such as cardiovascular disease and fatty liver disease. Their findings, published in the journal Nature, shine a light on the phenomenon known as reductive stress. So when your cells are experiencing reductive stress, NAD+ is low and NADH is high. And in this state, enzymes called the desaturase enzymes, like SCD1, are upregulated. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize a bunch of fancy terms. Just remember SCD1 right now. So the simple role of SCD1 is to add a double bond to saturated fat, turning it into MUFA. So SCD1 prevents adaptive thermogenesis, which means just burning calories. So higher SCD1 prevents this, and it is well demonstrated that those with obesity produce higher levels of SCD1. And so remember, we've now seen a reduction in saturated fat and more MUFA inside of us. Well, this is due to higher levels of SCD1. And we do not want SCD1 to be constantly upregulated, as this leads to less saturated body fat, more unsaturated body fat, which lowers metabolic rate, ultimately just a negative cycle. Unfortunately, many years of a high PUFA diet can dysregulate this system, and SCD1 can be chronically upregulated. And unfortunately, this current metabolic state for many humans is very similar to the state of hibernation for mammals like squirrels. Many metabolically unhealthy humans are in a hibernation-like state. So if you are a hibernating animal trying to sleep through the winter, you must slow your metabolic rate and lower your body temperature to preserve fat mass in order to survive. The last thing you want to do is waste calories as heat with a high and fast metabolic rate. Squirrels, as one example of many animals in the family tree that hibernates. So squirrels are omnivores who eat a variety of bulbs, tree shoots, buds, fungi, roots, eggs, small insects, small animals, and even snakes. But as winter approaches, squirrels switch to a diet very high in acorns, which are loaded with unsaturated fat, both MUFAs and PUFAs. And this change in dietary fat intake signals to the body that winter is coming, so enter hibernation. Multiple studies have shown that hibernating animals require significant PUFA in their diets to become fully torpid. And this study, shown in the bottom left here, shows that squirrels who fail to consume enough linoleic acid and omega-6 PUFA are actually unable to hibernate and quickly die in the cold. The squirrels needed about 8% of their calories to come from linoleic acid in order to be able to enter hibernation. And the standard American diet, meanwhile, passed that 8% linoleic acid threshold sometime between 1960 and 1980, around the same time the obesity epidemic began. And some estimates have the current consumption of linoleic acid over 25% of total daily calories for the average person. So back to hibernation, it's also called torpor, a state of torpor. It's an altered metabolic state characterized by high levels of fat-making enzymes and that desaturase enzyme SCD1 that we just talked about that turns saturated fat into monounsaturated fat, MUFA. So the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, AHR, this is just a transcription factor that regulates gene expression. So that will regulate numerous physiological functions like metabolism, reproduction, inflammation, and your circadian rhythm. Because remember, your gene expression is changing all the time. And so gene expression will turn on or turn off the hibernation state. For example, oxidized metabolites from the oxidation of PUFAs will increase gene expression to promote hibernation-like state. This hibernation-like state is also triggered through environmental toxins like BPA and plastics, which unfortunately have also drastically increased over the same timeline as our PUFA intake has increased. So there are actually a ton of parallels between hibernating animals and humans with metabolic problems. So the metabolic rate slows with reductive stress. SCD1 levels rise. In fact, obese women and women with gestational diabetes have been shown to have low activity at complex 2, which is part of the TCA cycle, aka citric acid cycle and energy metabolism, due to this high SCD1. This is just like hibernating squirrels. And then as a result of higher SCD1 levels, body fat composition changes, less saturated and more unsaturated. And so when lipogenic enzyme expression is very high, MUFA levels rise. So there's a positive feedback loop where dietary unsaturated fatty acids causes lipogenic enzymes to become upregulated, leading to lower saturated fat, higher MUFA, continual upregulation of lipogenic enzymes, high SCD1, lower metabolic rate. And so this is advantageous for animals in hibernation, but humans obviously don't hibernate. Humans now have more of a hibernation metabolism, down-regulated metabolism. Our cells are experiencing reductive stress with the buildup of electrons and more easily store fat than burn it. And obesities and diabetes are the human expression of mammalian torpor. So how do we get out of hibernation? Well, that's the magical question, isn't it? Here and throughout the course, we will provide our tips to help you do this. But we believe that it involves relearning how to properly burn carbohydrates, how to properly use carbohydrates, and have the body resaturate its tissues. So make our body fat more saturated fat, back to what our great-great-grandparents had. Because again, body fat composition acts as a signaling molecule inside of you. We will never have fully saturated fat. We will never have 100% saturated fat. That's not the goal, and that wouldn't be a good thing. But we want to return back to more of a natural composition, like your great-great-grandma. And as you burn carbs better, you'll get higher NAD+ and lower NADH, so better electron flow. And if you can do this consistently, you'll end up with more saturated body fat. So body fat composition is determined by a combination of factors such as your diet, like how many carbs you eat and how much PUFA you eat, lipogenic enzyme concentration, your metabolic rate, and environmental cues like day length and sunlight exposure, which modulates your vitamin D status. Well, vitamin D actually competes with the binding sites of the nuclear receptors that can trigger that hibernation mode. More vitamin D, less of that trigger. In fact, a recent review paper concluded that obese individuals have higher rates of vitamin D deficiency. One of the many reasons why maintaining good vitamin D status and getting sunlight throughout the day is very important. Toxic environmental compounds like dioxins, PCBs, excessive plastic exposure, etc., can also activate the transcription factor AHR, and this is not what we want. So when we are in reductive stress, so we have high NADH, low NAD+, your body will convert saturated fat into MUFA, which keeps us in torpor with metabolic inflexibility. And so this chain of events begins by consuming a diet high in PUFA, spending less time outside with less light exposure, lowering metabolic rate, increasing hibernation mode, losing the ability to properly burn carbohydrates, eating too many calories, lowering activity levels, and ending in gaining weight. Now, doesn't low carb fix carb utilization? No, avoiding carbs does not improve carb utilization. Keto and low carb is not the answer. Low carb diets are a band-aid. They're not going to cure fixing metabolic issues. It can reduce symptoms, so it can suppress symptoms, but there are underlying issues that partially block your carb utilization. It's like having leg pain, but skipping leg day. You no longer experience any leg pain since you're avoiding the trigger. When carb availability is low, the activity of the pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme, PDH, which is considered the gatekeeper in the oxidation of carbs, that decreases, hindering our carb oxidation capabilities, meaning we have more electron buildup and are in more of a reductive state since electrons aren't flowing. PDH is actually downregulated by an increase in dietary fat. In fact, only 24 hours of a high-fat, low-carb diet will decrease PDH activity in human skeletal muscle tissue. Again, the references and the research studies, links to those are in the PDF script for this module. And consuming low carb can actually reduce electron flow, lower that NAD plus to NADH ratio, increasing reductive stress. And we want better electron flow because better electron flow means higher metabolic rate and more ATP generated. Okay, finally, to tips to improve carb utilization. You guys can tell by now that we like to include a backup explanation as to why. So I will now cover some tips to improve how your body utilizes carbohydrates separated by exercise and activity, nutrition, environmental, and supplements. So the first is take more walks. Being more active throughout the day with light walks can help us better utilize carbs. And most people would benefit from being more active throughout the day. Our ancestors simply moved more, but nothing super crazy and strenuous. Walking places, milking cows, gardening, laundry, etc. So I think the best way to accomplish this is to just schedule more light walks in your day. Track your steps and shoot for 8,000 to 10,000 steps a day. 8,000 steps a day would be a great start. And if you're really struggling with meals, you can make sure that you add a walk right after the meal. So take a short 5-minute walk after you finish consuming a meal with carbohydrates. Tip number 2 is to strength train. So we want to exercise in a smart and intentional way with a focus on building muscle, not on simply burning calories. Building muscle changes our body composition and is simply one of the best ways to improve insulin sensitivity. There are hundreds of studies demonstrating the metabolic improvements from lifting weights and building muscle. It improves metabolic rate, it improves body composition, improves glucose utilization, and improves insulin sensitivity. I would argue that strength training is more important than cardio, as strength training builds muscle, and muscle acts as a glucose sink that helps us get glucose out of our bloodstream. Check out our Train to Change workout app if you are looking for an easy-to-use muscle-building workout app. The next tip is to get sunlight. As we talked about, vitamin D level is an important way to make sure that we're avoiding any increase in triggers to enter that hibernation state. This can really be accomplished by taking your walks outside. I like to try to tell people to get morning sunlight, midday sunlight, and evening sunlight, and trying to maintain a good vitamin D status throughout the year. So now for some nutrition tips. Tip number 4 is to keep your fat intake limited. I am not saying fat is bad, but when we are working on carb tolerance, we don't want that energy substrate competition. So here's a quote from the literature. Quote, chronic high-fat diets induction is associated with dysregulated glucose and lipid metabolism, and thus overall dysregulated energy homeostasis. Shifting the energy balance is the major cause for insulin resistance, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. High-fat diet treatment for 16 weeks was found to be associated with increased body weight, blood glucose, and fatty acid levels. There were significant reductions in glucose tolerance and insulin responsiveness. These findings established the link between high-fat diet intake, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. Here's another quote from the literature. Quote, it has been well established that the utilization of fat and carbohydrate as fuels, both at rest and during exercise, can be altered in response to an increase in dietary fat. Again, we are not saying you should consume zero fat, but sticking to the roughly 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight is a great target. In fact, our body can make its own dietary fat, and when it does, it largely makes saturated fat, which will help resaturate our tissues. Many people will bring up, the whole low-fat diet craze. of the 60s hasn't worked. Well, unfortunately, most people haven't gone low fat because most processed food that out at restaurants, it's high in carbs and high in fat. So if you look at actual dietary trends, Americans have increased carbs and fat, not gone low fat. The next tip is for the fats that you are consuming, we want to limit MUFAs and PUFAs, and we want to prioritize saturated fats. And this becomes even more important as your total dietary fat rises. So the amount of each fat, MUFA, PUFA, and saturated fat, can be tracked and monitored on Chronometer. And remember, all fat sources contain all three types. So the goal isn't zero PUFA. That's not possible. We just want to prioritize the fats that contain lower PUFA levels and more saturated fats. So on the left, we kind of have fats that you don't really want to consume all the time. So olive oil, we'll get into that in a few slides. Sunflower oil, canola oil, vegetable oil, peanuts, and cashews, as those are more MUFA and PUFA rich. And then on the right, you can see we've got more of the green, so more saturated fat. And these are typically animal fat plus chocolate. So chocolate, butter, dairy fat, tallow, coconut oil, ideally low PUFA eggs, and lard. So saturated fat versus MUFA versus PUFA, these are different biochemical structures, so of course they will be burned differently. Saturated fatty acid burning leads to a higher ratio of NAD plus to NADH, which is what we want. While PUFA, on the other hand, burns less oxygen. Here's a quote from the literature, quote, "At the stoichiometric level, the metabolism of polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFAs, utilize less oxygen than metabolizing either monounsaturated fatty acids or saturated fatty acids and yields fewer ATP per same length fatty acid," end quote. This just ultimately leads to a buildup and reductive stress. In fact, the type of fat you eat in a meal impacts your ability to use glucose at that meal. So eating a mixed meal with PUFA as opposed to a saturated fat cause lower rates of carbohydrate oxidation after the meal, which is not what we want. Remember, we want carbs to burn first, and then we'll get back to fat burning. So carb burning went down with a higher PUFA meal. This is shown on the left, corresponding with an increase in fat burning right after the meal, shown on the right. So the buildup of electrons and NADH are inhibiting PDH, leading to more reductive stress and not being able to use glucose well. So PUFAs burn first and they don't get out of the way. So the oxidized metabolites of PUFAs can damage structural components inside the body, increasing reductive stress, increasing fat storage tendencies due to signaling from higher fatty acid synthase levels. With more reductive stress, more carbs can then be turned into fat as the level of reductive stress in cells controls the expression of lipogenic genes and de novo lipogenesis. This is the process of converting carbs into fat that's upregulated when cells are in reductive stress. Normally, this is a very hard process to do, to convert carbs into fat molecules, but the cells can utilize that reductive stress, the energy in that reductive stress to power that, and that's obviously not what we want. Now, saturated fat, on the other hand, gets out of the way and lets us burn carbs. So here is just another example of how the type of fat we consume impacts energy metabolism and metabolic flexibility. So in this study, the PDH activity surged after exercise in the group that ate heavy cream. Heavy cream is rich in saturated fat, and so appropriately increasing blood glucose burning in response to exercise. Now, the sunflower oil group, on the other hand, that's the white boxes. Sunflower oil is high in PUFA. This group failed to increase glucose burning in response to exercise. This is not what we want to see. Now, you may be asking, what about MUFA and olive oil? We've talked about saturated fat and polyunsaturated fat. What about MUFA and olive oil? Well, unfortunately, high levels of MUFA in our diets can actually increase the trigger that converts linoleic acid and omega-6 PUFA into oxylipids. So these are undesirable compounds that play an unfavorable role in inflammation and metabolism. So one example is 5-HETE, 5-HEAT. This is a linoleic acid metabolite. Well, this is increased 24 times in obese humans versus lean humans. So linoleic acid, just standalone on its own, isn't exactly harmful. The problem is that when we consume it, it then gets converted into these like damaging compounds. So linoleic acid must be converted into arachidonic acid, AA. It must be converted there first, and arachidonic acid has 2 more double bonds than linoleic acid. So these enzymes D5D and D6D control the rate at which linoleic acid is converted into arachidonic acid, and the expression of D5D and D6D is controlled by your dietary oleic acid, so your dietary MUFA intake. There's an increase in the activity of these lipogenic enzymes like D6D when olive oil consumption is increased. Olive oil or other high MUFA sources like avocado oil can actually hinder carb metabolism when you are in a poor metabolic state if consumed in high quantities. So here are just some examples from the literature. Mice on the high oleic acid diet, so again, oleic acid is a MUFA. So mice on the high MUFA diet got fatter despite having the same amount of calories as the other group, and they had higher fasting glucose and insulin levels relative to the high carb diet. So olive oil gave those mice insulin resistance. Another example, the highest rates of obesity in Europe are actually in Greece, Spain, and southern Italy, where olives are grown and olive oil is used heavily. So remember, obese people are burning more fat and they aren't burning as much glucose. They aren't using glucose well. And in another diet, high MUFA diet was shown to increase fat accumulation. Here's the quote. Although there were no significant differences in energy intake and fat absorption among these three groups, compared with the high carbohydrate diet, both high monounsaturated fat diets produced hyperglycemia, obesity, and triglyceride accumulation in the liver and skeletal muscle. These data indicate that the recently recommended high monounsaturated fat diet might induce obesity and diabetes, end quote. So, of course, there are going to be studies showing that olive oil has tremendous health benefits. Well, any benefits in those studies are due to the polyphenols in olive oil, not necessarily due to the MUFAs in the oil itself. So it's just something to pay attention to when you're fixing metabolism and carb metabolism. Having some on occasion, if you really do enjoy MUFA or PUFA sources, is not going to kill you, but don't go out of your way to add a ton of them to your diet because you think you may be benefiting metabolism. So paying attention to the type of fat we are eating is especially important as we eat higher fat. You really don't want to have high MUFA or high PUFA diets. So it's kind of like do the opposite of what the American Health Association is telling you to do, because this on the left has not worked for American health, PUFA and MUFA rich. Now, things on the right, unfortunately, most conventional baked goods like this cake and bread products like this bun are made with vegetable oil, making them a strong PUFA source. But we really want to be cognizant of the amounts and the types of fat that we are consuming. So tip number 6 is to ensure a balanced protein intake, so more collagen. Now, dietary protein is not bad, and it has the highest thermic effect of any food and can be quite thermogenic, meaning it can help you raise your body temperature. Plus, protein sources like eggs, meat, and dairy, these are rich in micronutrients that will help you better utilize carbohydrates, very nutrient dense. But what if we aren't breaking the protein down? Or what if we are consuming protein in abundance, so BCAAs just sit in our bloodstream and compete with carbohydrates? This will negatively impact carb metabolism and is what can happen to those who are in a poor metabolic state. Yes, you need protein, and protein is good, but we don't have to go crazy overboard here. It's been known since 1969, and it's well documented in the literature that obese humans have high circulating branched chain amino acids, BCAAs, meaning valine, leucine, isoleucine. And so these are high in muscle meats, for example. And they also have been known to have low circulating levels of glycine in their blood. In fact, elevated BCAAs are accepted biomarkers of metabolic diseases, in addition to high serum insulin. So these individuals struggle breaking down the BCAAs. And again, going back to hibernating animals, torpid animals preserve lean mass by inhibiting the enzymes that break down branched chain amino acids. This is advantageous to survival during hibernation since you don't want to break down your muscle. So there are two potential problems here when in a broken metabolic state. First, branched chain amino acids, BCAAs, and glycine compete against each other. So dietary branched chain amino acids drive down glycine in skeletal muscle. And glycine helps you pull unburned fuel out of your cells, so helping reduce reductive stress, improving redox, getting rid of that electron buildup. So removing extra fuel will then increase mitochondrial efficiency. And then the second potential problem Amino acids and protein can also compete with carbohydrates to be burned for fuel. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just how the body switches fuel sources. But again, paying attention to this when in a poor metabolic state is important. So, complete protein sources like muscle meat, dairy, eggs, and then even some grains contain BCAAs, branched chain amino acids, and essential amino acids, whereas collagen sources contain the conditional amino acids, but these are very pro metabolic, like hydroxyproline, glycine, arginine, and proline. And in fact, restriction of BCAAs has actually been shown to reverse obesity. We are not saying to restrict BCAAs or to go to extremes, but we do want to make sure you're including collagen in your diet. This is important. And also that we're not going overboard on our protein intake, as that isn't really needed, and you don't have to consume a ton of protein to reap the benefits. More than 0.8 grams per pound of body weight really is excessive and can cause metabolic problems for those that are in a poor metabolic state. Tip number 7, kind of obvious here, but consume carbohydrates. So we've discussed the benefits of carbs extensively so far in this course, but you can't improve metabolic flexibility and carb burning without consuming carbs. It's still funny that low carb folks will say that consuming low carb improves metabolic flexibility when it does the exact opposite. Not eating carbs induces a state of insulin resistance, which you can fix. So consuming carbohydrates and properly oxidizing carbohydrates will reduce reductive stress by increasing NAD+, and thus improving the NAD+ to NADH ratio, so reducing the amount of reductive stress. And here are just some interesting figures from USDA data documenting that obesity trends are continuing to rise, while actually carb and sugar intakes have actually gone down since the year 2000. And tip number 8 is to eat nutrient-dense foods. So we also want to make sure we're eating a nutrient-dense diet with ample vitamins and minerals to ensure the electron transport chain has all the nutrients it needs for proper glucose oxidation. Because sometimes a nutrient deficiency could actually be why you can't process carbohydrates well. Promoters of the pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme, PDH, include magnesium, so this is going to be rich in fruit, potatoes, other carb sources, calcium, which is going to be rich in dairy sources or well-cooked collard greens, and B vitamins, vitamin B1, vitamin B2, vitamin B5, biotin, and these are all going to be rich in eggs, dairy, and meat, and actually sourdough bread contains quite a bit of B vitamins as well. Another example is vitamin K2, which has been shown to improve insulin sensitivity and glucose metabolism. The best sources there are going to be pasteurized egg yolks and various animal fats like dairy. Now, you don't have to overconsume animal fats to get the amounts you need. Consuming all of these foods in moderation and balance is important. So for tip number 8, eating nutrient-dense foods, we really just want to make sure that we're eating a well-rounded diet with regular inclusion of eggs, meat, seafood, and dairy on the protein side to give you one group of micronutrients, plus fruit, potatoes, sourdough, etc., to provide another unique set of nutrients. And then supplement when needed to fill micronutrient gaps. For example, various B vitamins or vitamin K2. But of course, first focus on eating whole foods. So now we'll cover the remaining tips quickly. The tip number 9 is reduce plastic exposure whenever we can. So plastic exposure can increase those hibernation trigger signals, just like PUFA oxidation. So try to not heat your food up in plastic containers. Don't pour hot bone broth or hot liquids into a plastic cup. Just really do what you can to reduce your exposure to plastics. Tip number 10 is to drink pure DT. I don't know how to pronounce it properly. It's spelled there on the screen. It's actually a potent suppressor of SCD1, reducing fat storage signals and improving metabolism. This is actually a very traditional tea consumed in China. So try to find some that does not come wrapped in plastic. I like the loose leaf tea that you can then steep into hot water and then strain those out before drinking the tea. And the 11th tip is kind of a bonus optional tip because we want to make sure that you do everything else prior. You don't want to start with tip 11. But one option would be to look into SEA as a supplement. Again, this is optional, and it's not going to work if you're still consuming a ton of MUFAs and PUFAs, so this should not be step 1. Master your nutrition principles first. But remember, fats serve as signaling molecules. Most Americans have lowered our stearic acid content in our fats, and stearic acid is a very beneficial type of saturated fat, many pro-metabolism qualities. So stearic acid makes a signaling molecule called SEA that helps fight against the hibernation signals that come from any signaling molecules from PUFA and MUFA. Because again, it's not about avoiding PUFA and MUFA, it's about having the right ratios so that way these signaling molecules are kind of more in balance. So supplementing SEA can help replace the stearic acid signaling you may have lost due to changes in your body fat, more unsaturation. Studies in rodents have shown SEA to reduce appetite, suppress the enzyme SCD1 in the liver, and to have powerful anti-inflammatory effects. One option for SEA is from our friend Brad at Fire in a Bottle. All right, let's summarize. So improving how well we use carbohydrates should require exercise and nutrition tweaks. For exercise, we should start with regular daily movement and light walks throughout the day where you are getting sunlight. So shoot for 8,000 steps a day. Adding in 2 to 3 strength sessions a week where you're focusing on building muscle. And then a diet that someone can try out if in a very metabolically damaged place, moderate protein, high in collagen, lower fat, and moderate to high carb, including starches and sucrose sources. Just making sure you include starches that you tolerate well. In fact, going higher carb and lower fat and lower protein for a period of time has actually been shown in the literature to help restore metabolic function. At the end of the day, what you've been doing up to this point hasn't been working, or else you would not be in this course. So when you are able to relearn how to better use glucose, you can then burn all fuel sources more effectively, meaning your body can better partition fuel sources to the different tissues throughout the day instead of letting unused energy get stored. So as one improves metabolism and body composition and relearns how to use glucose, more of a mixed diet can be used if desired.